We're going to talk about the Roman Empire, and when we speak about the Roman Empire, we talk about really the time when Augustus takes over. So, before we get to Augustus, let's talk about what the importance of Rome is. First and foremost, is it was one of the longest living civilizations in history, from about 500 BCE till 476 AD, or the Common Era. Rome was the civilization on Earth. So let's talk about the Roman Empire. The first emperor was Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, who also became known as Caesar Augustus. And he really started the idea of the empire as a peaceful place for people to thrive in. And his rules and government structure allowed for a Roman peace for the next 200 years. The other things that we're going to be looking at for the Roman Empire is how Rome truly believed that they were divinely put on earth to rule the world, which several other groups have come to that conclusion, least of which would be the Nazis. So, the age of Augustus, 31 BCE to 14 AD. From a young age, he was groomed to take over Rome, which did not mean that he was an easy shoe-in. He did have his own issues to deal with, especially with Mark Antony, which you'll see in the videos that you're watching. He was a savvy politician, but he was also very smart in the sense of how to gain power and how power is thrust upon him. In 27 BCE, he restored the Republic as opposed to what Julius Caesar had done by declaring himself dictator for life. Of course, Julius Caesar was stabbed on the Ides of March by the Senate, and very famous line in Shakespeare, "Et tu, Brutus," meaning Brutus, being Caesar's right-hand man, also participated in the stabbing. When Augustus ascended to the throne, the Senate bestowed on him the title of Augustus, or revered one, and he preferred the title Princeps, which is first among equals or the chief citizen. His rule is called the Principate, where he was the co-ruler with the Senate of the empire. He really was in charge, but he was publicly very complimentary to the Senate. He appeared to be sharing the power, but everybody really knew that he was large and in charge. In terms of his army, he maintained a huge number of soldiers, 150,000, 28 legions, and there were 5,400 men to a legion. So when you think about some of our big legions that you'll see in historical movies being wiped out, that's quite a few men getting wiped out all at once. Most of these soldiers were from Italy and were citizens of Rome. He also had 130,000 other men who had been taken from areas outside of Rome and were secondary soldiers. His top level of soldier was called the Praetorian Guard, and these were the 9,000 men who guarded the emperor and his family. The Praetorian Guard are going to show up as a very significant influence in politics in a few years, especially with the Emperor Nero. Augustus was an excellent bureaucrat. He understood how to manage things, so he developed a very easy system to work with. He split the provinces, and in each province he appointed a governor. These governors were called legates, or deputies, and eventually Augustus started naming all the legates. He stabilized the provinces, expanded Roman rule northward until they hit the Rhine, and the Germanic tribes, as you'll see in the videos you were assigned, really held them back. So Augustus, he knew when it wasn't worth the time and effort, and he just let them be. And that really is the sign of a good leader a lot of times, is knowing when you're beat or knowing when a fight is not worth having. In society, there were three levels: the senators, who helped run the empire. They held great government offices and senior military posts and governed the provinces. To be eligible to be a senator, you had to have property worth 1,000,000 sesterces a year. I'm sorry, 1,000,000 sesterces. Just to kind of put that in context, a military man made about 900 sesterces a year. So clearly, you had to be very, very wealthy. If you think about in this society how the vast majority of our congressmen and senators are, in fact, millionaires, you'll get a certain parallel going. The next level in society was the equestrian society, and these were all Roman citizens who held property worth about 400,000 sesterces. They held lesser positions than the senatorial class, but they were also in government and military. And again, if you want to compare this to modern day United States, you would think of your upper middle class, the folks who um, made well into the several hundred thousand but would never be considered rich, rich. Then you had the lower classes, and that was the overwhelming majority of most of the citizens in Rome. Augustus was a social conservative, and if you think about some of the more social conservative politicians of our day, the ones who want to really outlaw a lot of the social issues like gay marriage. They want to outlaw abortion. They want to outlaw any kind of sexual activity that's not mandated by the Bible. It's sort of the same kind of concept. He wanted people to have very large families because remember, the larger the family, the more citizens Rome would have. He discouraged love affairs, and especially because an illegitimate child doesn't carry his father's name. He actually exiled his own daughter, Julia, who you'll see her picture on the right hand side of your screen, for adultery. When we say adultery, you have to kind of keep in mind that Julia was way beyond adultery. She was a big fan of orgies, and she actually seduced many of her father's friends just to kind of rebel against him. He also made divorce much more difficult to get, which is ironic since both he and his wife were divorced when they married. And he revised the tax laws so that they would punish bachelors, widowers, and families with less than three children. Octavian Augustus was the ruler for 45 years. And during that time, Rome hit its peak in terms of peace and prosperity. And this is called the Pax Romana. And this laid the foundation for the next 150 years of Roman history. The Pax Romana, when there's peace, that allows building projects, especially infrastructure. And when one is in Italy, especially in the area of Rome, one sees all these magnificent buildings that were built during this period. Because when the government is not spending tons of money on military, they have the money to spend on these infrastructure projects. When Augustus was getting older, he had to find a successor. And he had one child, Julia, who survived to adulthood, so he needed to find somebody. And he designated his stepson. Augustus was married to Livia. Livia and Augustus had been married before they married each other. And Livia brought to the marriage her son, Tiberius, who became Augustus's stepson. So Tiberius was induced to divorce his wife, whom he loved very much, so he could marry Julia, Augustus's daughter from his first marriage. Are we keeping track here? So Augustus and Livia had both of their children marry each other, and this consolidated the power so that nobody could question whether Tiberius was the right man for the job. Tiberius was a hardcore military guy, and as such, he started off wonderfully as the emperor after Augustus died. And this was all well and good until his son dies in battle. When Tiberius' son died in battle, this changed everything for Tiberius. He had been paranoid. He had been putting his enemies on trial for treason, which is standard procedure for most emperors, and most emperors today would not disagree with his motives at all. However, when his son died, he became very depressed and very withdrawn. He eventually moved to the Isle of Capri and started living his life in a way that very few would commend. He knew his wife was exiled for adultery, Julia, as we had talked about in a previous screenshot, but he also had a little problem. He liked little boys and girls, but 7, 8, 9 years old. That was his preferred age. So when he went off to the Isle of Capri to run the Roman Empire from afar, he also brought with him dozens of young children who would basically service him throughout the day. This, for the son in law of the family values guy, was really just the beginning of some of the worst emperors that we saw from the Augustan line. When Tiberius had been emperor for a few years, he was older, he was sick, and he died in 37. Tiberius left his powers jointly to Caligula, who was Augustus's grandnephew, and Tiberius Gemellus, who was Tiberius's grandson. Caligula's first act on becoming princeps was to void Tiberius's will and have Gemellus executed. Again, not that unusual in terms of an empire or an emperor, mostly because this kind of thing was pretty straightforward political machinations in those days, in the same way that when we see a politician smearing another politician in a commercial these days, we don't think anything of it. What it did do, however, is it consolidated Caligula's power, and Caligula became one of the most notorious of the Roman emperors. If you have an overwhelming desire to watch a really terrible movie, back in the late 70s, early 80s, a movie called Caligula was put out, and it is just terrible. But if you find those kinds of movies interesting, it is worth a watch just to see how bad it really is. So, Caligula takes over in 37, and he, at first, is a pretty good ruler. Sure, he killed his rival. That's not a big deal. And the first 2 years, he was pretty good. And then after that, things started to go downhill for Caligula. He was very cruel to everyone. He was in his family, near him, in the Senate. He was very extravagant. He spent money hand over fist. And the sexual perversity is really catalyst of his affection and love affair with his sister. In a sense, by the time he had been ruling the Roman Empire for 2 or 3 years, it was pretty clear to the Praetorians and the senators that he was never going to be a good emperor. So the Praetorian Guard and the senators basically took it upon themselves to assassinate him, which worked out pretty well for Claudius. Claudius is Caligula's uncle, and he was never truly considered for the emperor position, mostly because he was disabled. His family never considered him appropriate. He had bad legs. He had some kind of similar Parkinson's situation where he constantly shook. He slobbered, his nose ran, and he stammered, and people had a hard time understanding him. Modern scholars believe that he had cerebral palsy or Tourette syndrome. There are a variety of issues that people looked at with Claudius, but he was actually a terrific emperor, and he did a really good job for the 13 years he was emperor. Of course, in the great um, thought process of the Roman Empire, you're never safe. And Claudius was certainly not safe from his wife. So Claudius was actually poisoned by his wife Agrippina. And Agrippina killed her husband mostly because she wanted her son Nero to become the emperor. So Claudius dies, Nero becomes the emperor. Nero, even though he was brought to the throne by his mother, decided that the first act he would make sure was carried out was that his own mother was killed, because you don't want the person who brought you to the throne to control you on the throne. So he had his mother killed, he had any enemies killed. The problem with Nero was he had no interest in running the Roman Empire. He was, in fact, completely focused on his acting career. And I'm not kidding. So he would put on shows and he would play all the parts, and the Senate and the high citizens of Rome would come in, watch him, and be forced to clap and appreciate his great acting skills. One of the big things that Nero is known for, and whether or not it's actually true is still under debate, is the fact that he wanted to build a new palace. But he couldn't build a new palace because there were already buildings in the location where he wanted to build. So he burned down those buildings. So the Great Roman Fire, which destroyed a huge swath of Roman land, is one of the better known stories about Nero. Supposedly he fiddled while Rome burned, but it's never been proven. But of course, after the section of Rome was burned down, Nero had the ability to build his fabulous new palace. Eventually, his extravagances, and he was bankrupting Rome with all of his building projects, the Praetorian Guard again decided it was time for Nero to kill himself. So Nero was forced to commit suicide. After Nero was killed, or killed himself, and his famous last words were, "Oh, the world has lost a great artist." Well, that's always been debatable. So after he died, and Nero didn't have any children that would be a good candidate for emperor, this was followed by a brief period of civil war. There was no defined successor. And we saw 3 emperors rise and fall in 18 months. Finally, we see Vespasian, and he comes to the role of emperor, and he becomes the first ruler of the Flavian dynasty. Prior, all of the emperors that we have talked about, from Augustus through Nero, were part of the Augustan dynasty, because they were all related to Augustus. Vespasian, not related to Augustus, starts a new dynasty of leaders. Vespasian is best known for constructing the Colosseum. And if you've been to Rome, the Colosseum is extremely well built. It still stands. You can still see the seats. It looks like a modern stadium. And you can also, they pulled up the floor. You'll see the picture on the right hand side. They picked up the floor so that you could see all the channels or all the booths where the animals would be kept, or the slaves were kept, or the gladiators were kept, until they had to come out and fight. Vespasian was also a very good manager, and he made a lot of financial reforms that fixed the excesses of Nero. He was succeeded by his sons Titus and then Domitian. From 96 to 180, we have the era of the 5 good emperors, and they are Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And why were these the five good emperors? And it's basically they did a good job. They treated the ruling classes with respect. You gotta pay homage to the money people. They cooperated with the Senate. They did not execute their political enemies. They maintained peace throughout the empire. They supported domestic policies for the empire. They were tolerant, diplomatic, politic, and they developed extensive building projects. They developed their infrastructure. And think about it. If you want to put people to work, you get them to build things. And this is a very good policy. If you go back to the United States in the 1920s and 1930s when we had the financial markets crash and Franklin Delano Roosevelt took over as president, that's how he got people back to work. He built the roads, he built highways, he built bridges, he developed all these infrastructure projects that still stand to this day. So these emperors really were there to build Rome up. Trajan particularly extended the empire through Europe, Mesopotamia, and the Middle East. Hadrian realized that expanding the empire was dangerous because it required too much governance, so he did not extend the empire. You got to think about it from this perspective. The more you have to manage, the harder it gets. So, by keeping the empire at very specific geographical points, you're able to manage it better. Hadrian, if you go to Scotland, there is a wall that literally divides Scotland in half. And that is called Hadrian's Wall, and it was built by the Romans to identify the uppermost border of the Roman Empire. Of course, beyond Hadrian's Wall, you had a whole bunch of Scottish tribes who didn't give a clam about the Romans. But up until the geographic wall, or the Wall of Hadrian, that is where Rome extended its reach. At its height, the 2nd century Rome covered 3.5 million square miles and had approximately a population of 50 million. 1 million in the city of Rome alone. That's a huge number. And if you look at the map that's on this slide, you'll see that you have Britain, and you'll see the little line up here that represents Hadrian's Wall. You have all of Spain, all of France, all of Switzerland, part of Germany, all of Austria, all the way down into Turkey, the Middle East, North Africa. You have all of this area that belonged to Rome, and that really does define in large measure why it was so important in terms of Western history. Now, how did Rome manage 50 million people in a time period where this really is a huge number of people? First, they allowed all the people in these areas to keep their own languages, their own customs. Latin was the language of government and politics, so domestic matters really could be handled in their own languages. One of the things that the Romans liked to do was when they went into a land, they would talk to the leader, and they basically gave him a deal. They said, here's the deal. You can surrender. You can keep your position as head of your tribe. You can ensure peace and prosperity. We will give you bread. We will provide you entertainment. And all you have to do is pay a little bit of tax to the Roman Empire. Not so bad. Alternatively, if you don't like that option, you can be enslaved and be our slaves, or we'll kill you. So most tribal leaders saw this as a pretty much win-win situation by letting Rome take them over. With all this peace came trade opportunities. One of the things the Romans were very famous for were building roads. And one of the most important roads that they built was the Appian Way, and it went from Rome down through the heel of Italy in a small town called Brindisi, which is right across, if you look at the map, right across from the Macedonia place. So it's right on the heel of Italy. But this became a major road for them in terms of trading with the south. Going north, they could trade up here, but really the trade that they were most focused on was to the south of them because North Africa, the Middle East, Greece, Thrace, Macedonia, these were the big areas for trade. Of course, with trade, then you need manufacturing. So again, what you began to see is the rise of the business classes, the rise of small businesses in all these little local lands. So people were making money, they were happy, they were living in a peaceful environment. What is not to love by all of this? Another great part of the Roman time period during this moment is Roman law. So here are the principles that were developed. All men are created equal. This was recognized, but it was certainly not followed, but at least the principle was developed. Another major element here is that a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. We still use this today. An accused person could defend themselves before a judge. Again, we still use this today. And judges were supposed to be impartial and look only at the evidence. All of these elements are part of our legal system today. They're considered part of a civilized society. And when you think that these are all 2,000-year-old concepts, it's pretty remarkable that Roman men were already thinking in this way. In terms of women, upper class women had a lot more freedom than they ever had before. They could own, inherit, and dispose of property. They could go out in public without a male escort. They could do their own business. Keeping in mind that today, in a country like Saudi Arabia, they can't do any of this. So, Roman expectations of female behavior were actually more advanced 2,000 years ago than they are today in a country like Saudi Arabia. Also, Roman Empire, Roman emperors started with Augustus, promised the citizenry grain and entertainment, otherwise known as the bread and circuses. And the entertainment were chariot races, gladiatorial shows. They also had plays and readings and poetry and storytelling. So these spectacles allowed people to have a good time, and they didn't think about political issues. They didn't think about revolting. The religion in Rome is very much similar to what you would see in ancient Greece. It was a polytheistic situation where people could believe in any number of gods, and almost all of the Roman gods were based on the Greek gods. And you'll see here there's a list of the equivalents from Roman to Greek, and then what they were actually the god of. Keeping in mind that religion was really developed in these ancient days to explain things that man could not explain. So, if there was a bad storm on the sea, that was because Poseidon or Neptune was mad. If a person couldn't have children, it was because Hera or Juno were not happy with them. If the hunt went bad, it was because Artemis or Diana was not being pleased. So, again, what it was for these early Romans was a way to explain the unexplainable that now, with science, we know. The real big part of religion is the rituals and ceremonies. We all love them. It's like going to church on Christmas Eve. You may never step foot into a church any other time of the year, but there's a great emotional moment of walking in and sharing this moment with a bunch of other people. Rome allowed other cultures to worship their own gods. They were very tolerant. If you wanted to worship a head of cabbage, that was fine. The problem came in is when it threatened public order or morale. And specifically, Christianity was a big one. And you can look at it from the perspective of how communists look at religion today. Communists don't like religion because it forces people to put God ahead of the value of the state or the political system. And that is not a good thing according to a communist person. Same thing with Romans. They didn't care who you worshiped as long as Rome came first. And if Rome didn't come first, then there was a problem with that religion. So the persecution of Christians was not systematic, but sporadic, because the Christians were actually a very small minority of the population. The picture that you see on the slide is the lions attacking the Christians in a Colosseum type arena. And this is one of those standard stories that we hear very often about how the Christians were persecuted, and they were persecuted. And pretty much, if you were a Roman and you saw Christians being thrown into an arena with hungry lions, it pretty much told you that this is not a religion you want any part of. Originally, Christians were being persecuted by Nero because when he burned down Rome, remember him building his own palace, he blamed the Christians. And of course, this is what started the whole throwing the Christians in the arenas with the tigers and lions and bears. Oh my. At the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd, several natural catastrophes hit Rome. The river Tiber flooded, there was a famine, there was a plague brought back from the east, there was a shortage of manpower that meant the military was short-handed. So you had a combination of all these issues. And remember, at the time, we didn't understand flooding. We didn't understand the plague. We didn't understand famine when the crops didn't grow. So, of course, people thought the gods were mad. The Emperor Septimus Severus, doesn't he sound familiar to the Harry Potter fans? He was the emperor from 193 to 211. He was a firm believer in military society. His sons took over at his death, perpetuating this idea. And what they did was they expanded the army, they increased the pay for the soldiers, and the military officers were appointed as government officials. At this stage, what we're seeing is too much military power resulted in these generals vying to become emperor. Chaos resulted. We're going to pick this up on the next video, but this is pretty much the first half of the Roman Empire, not to be confused with the Roman Republic. And from here on out, things pretty much go downhill with a few bright spots. So